Hello, this is Book Review of Slave Narratives, a folk history of slavery in the United States from interviews with former slaves, administrative files, selected records bearing on the history of slave narratives by Work Projects Administration. There's 9,400 words. I listened to it on fast speed in about 3 hours or something. I don't know what it would be on slow speed. I need to do the figurings. But it has 17 chapters: Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Maryland, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. I didn't really distinguish the different states, but yeah, it's an interesting read. Good to hear. Interesting. There were just stories of really old slaves, a lot of really old people who've been around since before the slavery days, and men and women. And I'm kind of doing American history section right now, and I did the narrative of Frederick Douglass last week, and he was an escaped slave, and he only had negative things to say about slavery. He said that the slaves who work in the plantation really have it bad, but a lot of the slaves that I heard here, what I kind of took away from the book is, a lot of these slaves actually liked slavery. A lot of them, some of them were treated well in the plantation, and said that the slavery days were happier for the slaves because life was simpler. Didn't have to make any decisions and stuff. But some of the others didn't. There was one story where bunch of slaves, I think after they got their freedom, they wanted to kill their white master and take their land or something, but the other black people didn't agree with that, so they strung them up. And a lot of when they had to set their slaves free, they told them they set their slaves free, and but on most occasions the slaves just stayed and just received money. One of the guys, he told his slaves that he'd have to set him free because he didn't have the money to pay him anymore, because I guess he didn't have any money for, I don't know why, he didn't explain. The economy was different, but the slaves stayed, and they didn't really see. A lot of slaves were really ignorant because they were separated from their parents and they weren't allowed to read and stuff, so they didn't even know what money was, so they just stayed, and they didn't even ask for money. They just stayed and worked, and it was just kind of like it was before, because they just had a nice owner who just they lived a simple life. But in a lot of the stories of the book, they would say how big they were. They're like, Jim Douglas, and they were little. Like one guy 5'3", 130 pounds. One guy 5'6", 150 pounds. A woman 5 feet even, 105 pounds. 5'2", 110 pounds. And so, yeah, people back then were slender. They weren't fat like they are now, because they probably didn't eat that much. They just worked all day long. But I remember hearing in a lot of these stories that they complained that some of the owners just would whip them. They'd get whipped all the time, if they were, because the owner thought that they were working too slowly in the field, so they'd get whipped. And and when they did this story, they actually used the language that they use, and it's interesting hearing their language, because they said chidden, not children, and the slaves had children, and they kept in touch with their children, and had it's just like white people. But and what was some of the other dialects they had? Oh, they used the N word like it was just another word. That was the only word they had for African American, was the N word, and they used it for themselves. So back then it wasn't a negative connotation at all. And I'm sure the white people would call them that, and that's just how they called them, because it was the only word that they had. So I'd like to read about the history of that word and see when blacks decided that they didn't like it, and it meant like a derogatory word, because it sure wasn't back in these days. This book was written in 1941, so I don't know when the actual stories were recorded. But yeah, a lot of the people, it was just, you know, really old people just telling their story, and you know, just like once, and then talking about the Civil War, that one of them sat there and saw a bunch of Union soldiers walk by in their blue outfits, and they didn't do anything to the slaves. They didn't like hurt them or anything, but they didn't steal anything from their house or anything. They just didn't pay any attention to them. But they killed a cow and fed themselves with it, and so yeah, that's about what I took away from it. That's about as much as you can take away from a 9,400 word book. I don't know how many pages that is. It's not recorded here. And I don't have it memorized yet. And about while you're riding your bike, paying attention to other things. But yeah, it was interesting. I'm glad I powered through that book. All right, peace out.